Thanks, Mark. And thanks, Adam, for pulling together the program today. It's really, really good speakers with some different, very important perspectives right now. Well, here we are, the post-Cold War era has ended, and I think it's changing everything. And we're going to look at this from an economic perspective, but I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on the tragedy that's going on, and sending our thoughts and prayers out to all those that are affected by this. It's terrible to watch what we see on TV every night and go through this the way we are. But it's also a reminder that this is a time where leaders either step up or shrink. And President Zelensky really reminded us again that character matters. And I just want to read a piece from Andy LaPerriere, who's the head of US policy at Piper Sandler. He said, "It's hard to know how much President Zelensky's personal courage has changed events, but it appears to have had a profound impact. By risking his life to defend his country, he's inspired his countrymen to fight. The military situation on the ground might have been a lot different if he had fled. His heroic answer to the US offer of safe passage, 'The fight is here, I need ammunition, not a ride,' made a difference." And according to a Washington Post story, Zelensky's personal appeal for help during a video conference call with European leaders moved some of them to tears and played a key role in their decision to embrace the crippling economic sanctions they had previously rejected. I also think it moved them to step up from a military perspective as well, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But I'm going to focus on it from an economic perspective, but it is really hard to disassociate ourselves from the tragedy that's going on there. This community, I know, feels it, and particularly because of the close ties to that part of the world for so many of you. I'm not expert in this part of the country, but from a macroeconomic perspective, I feel comfortable that we've had a good sense of what was going on in the world at ARS for some time. We focused on these 6 transformations, and now the geopolitical one has come to the fore again. For some time, our concern was about parts of the Middle East, the South China Sea, and what's going on with Russia and their uncertain foreign policy as to how they would manage that in the world we're in today. We're getting the answers on that, and I think what's happening is going to affect all the areas that we've touched on for some time. And this is a different period we've been in, and for most of us, we've lived for most of our lives in the post-Cold War period. For those old enough to remember the Cold War period, it's not a fun time for what's going on in the world, but it also changes the way countries look at the world and look at their own country and think about their role in the problem. So this will have implications for politics on a local level as well as on a global level, and how some of the social and societal issues we faced are going to be addressed as well. So it has big implications, and it's going to be with us for a long time in our view. Coming into this, we were starting to see slowing global growth. We were in tightening cycles for monetary policy coming out of the pandemic. One of the big considerations we have in most of the world have underinvested on defense, and that is going to change and is changing rapidly. There was a big climate change focus. We think that's shifting to energy security. And I think, as one of the speakers will highlight, China's role in this is actually going to be fascinating, because they've been observing. They tend not to get involved in other nations' businesses, so they stand apart from this, but this has big implications for the future of China's aspirations politically and as well as nationally. So we think this is going to play out in material ways for a lot of areas. The other part I would just touch on is economically. Greg mentioned this earlier. The sanctions are not a panacea, and they come with unintended consequences. So we have to be careful about what the implications are of these sanctions, because there's somebody on the other side of the trades that are going on, whether it's the banking system or other areas. There's food issues coming out of this as well that we have to be concerned about. Food security is another area that with Ukraine wheat and Russian agricultural business, this is a key element of things that would change. And also the displacement of millions of people, both inside Ukraine and in Europe, creates another set of strains on the system, and is a tragedy on top of that. So we have to really think about this from a multi-dynamics. I've shown this chart before. This was coming into the year what the IMF was projecting for growth, and we think that growth is going to take potentially a 1% hit from this, if not more. It's too hard to know right now, but the changes that are going to happen from the disruptions, you can figure we're going to have slower growth, whether it's 1.5 or less, it doesn't matter. It changes the direction and the trajectory for a lot of things at a time that we were slowing already. So that puts greater strains on leaders to how governments and central banks on how they react and how they respond to this. And it's not all about economics, so I don't want to make it seem like that, but for this part, it is really about the macro and what it means. I do think that you have, when you see the devaluation of the ruble and the challenges that creates and the implications of that are pretty significant. You were seeing challenges economically in a lot of areas throughout, and this is going to play out in ways that we're going to have to digest as it evolves. I think from a monetary perspective, it's likely going to slow the tightening process, and they'll be likely to let inflation run a little hotter. But there also could be a cooling of the inflation because of the slowing growth that exists. This was the Fed funds projection for the end of the year was 0.9%, which would have meant 3 rate increases. We'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute. I think one of the big changes that's happening is nations' views of their defense spending. This is a chart of the top 10 spenders from the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute. Clearly, the US has been the big spender, and that's allowed NATO nations to kind of tag along and not make their commitments on the 2% targets. I think right now about a third of the nations are at the 2% target. I would just say for some of them, because of the financial challenges the last couple of years, they're at that target because their growth has come down, not because their spending has gone up. And I think what's happening right now, and you saw it with Germany, was a major change. And I just want to give you a sense of what's happened over the years because of the lack of investment. So in 2018, the German military capabilities were summed up in a couple comments. At that point, none of the German submarines were operational. Only 4 of their 128 Eurofighter jets were combat ready. The Army was short of dozens of tanks and armored vehicles needed for NATO missions. The troops were short on basics, body armor, night vision gear, cold weather clothing. And it was so bad that 19 helicopter pilots were forced to turn in their licenses because of lack of training time. The reason was there weren't enough helicopters for the pilots to fly. So that was several years ago, but it gives you a sense of, as we went on through this Cold War period, or the post-Cold War period, the spending started to decline. There was more focus on economics than there was on military security. We think that's going to change, but it's not just in Europe. Japan and South Korea are stepping up their spending. We would expect India and the Saudis to do the same. So this is going to be a major change. And just to give you a sense, in the US, aerospace and defense of the S&P weighting is about 2.4% of the market. The top 5 companies had a market cap of between $500 billion and $1 trillion. And that's where much of the defense businesses around the world. So it gives you a sense of perspective, how light this area is, and you can see an investment opportunity there. It's one that we've been invested in for some time, and in some of our portfolios, we're 3 to 4 times the weighting because of our concerns about this. We're long-term, and that's a big change. I think the other big change is the focus that's going to shift to climate security. And I think that puts us in a different spot where trading is going to go, but also how we look at the fossil fuel companies and their role in this energy transition and the role in energy security. I think what we're seeing with the changes with the Nord issue, with the reliance of Europe on Russian natural gas, and to be feeling like you're hostage to any one country is going to change the dynamics of how people think about their energy security, and that will have some profound impacts on where we're going as a global economy and where we're going from this climate shift. You can't postpone, but you might readjust the priorities and think about how we get there differently. And I think that's going to be one of the fallouts that comes out of this war that we're in right now. So will it lead to a recession? And the simple answer is it depends on Russia, and it depends on the central banks. Typically, a recession comes from three factors all hitting at once. It starts with the economy overheats, which leads to, you have a very strong economy, which leads to increased use of energy. So oil and energy prices rise, which then leads to higher inflation, which forces the central banks to bring rates down. And we were moving prior to this with a little bit higher pressure on, could there be a recession? The answer was, everyone was thinking it depends on how fast the Fed moves and how fast other central banks move. I think right now we're seeing slowing global growth as a result of this. You're seeing higher spikes in oil prices, but you're not sure how long that's going to persist. And in that environment, central bankers will likely take a more measured approach to rate increases. So where the market was at 5 to 6 increases for this year, and at one point, even a week or so ago, they were looking at 7 increases. We think that math has changed, and the Fed will start raising rates, but will be much more measured, likely only doing 25, not 50, and then maybe even spacing out their increases. But they will start the increase process, because if there is a recession, they need some breathing room to do that. It's not the time for central banks to be too aggressive given the uncertainties. However, we think there are focuses for investors that will present better opportunities to preserve capital and build capital in this environment. And that's a shift back to some of the fossil fuel areas. It's going to continue to be in the tech area as the battle lines are being drawn around tech as well. But we think that some of the commodity plays around security, whether it's the rare earths, whether it's copper, whether it's the metals, are all going to play a role in these transitions that we're going through. And there will be opportunities to build capital in this environment. They won't be as broad as they were in a regular growth environment. We think you still want to invest in the secular trends. And the one thing I would say that's changed in our view, two things that have really changed, is our certainty around the inflation becoming more deflationary is under question, because one of the key elements of that was globalization, and globalization has changed here. The second is that we were big on CapEx driving productivity to offset some of the inflation pressures. We think the large companies will continue to spend big on CapEx, which will allow them to invest in greater productivity and deal with some of the price pressures that they're faced with and manage their costs better. But smaller businesses that have less of a cushion for their financial position will be rethinking how fast they're going to be making CapEx expenditures until they get a better sense of how things shake out, which means earnings will be the key driver and the beneficiaries again will be unequal. So Mark, I'm going to stop here and open it up to a couple of questions and then really jump to Adam's part of the program. So let me stop there.
Sure. Any questions, comments so far?
Excellent.
I just have one comment from Tatiana. She said she's trying to connect, but internet is very slow. So I said to her, anytime you join, I'll just stop others talk so that she can express whatever we want to hear, and then in case the internet drops.
Can you get 15
Mariana,
seconds on her background?
Mariana, just a quick thought before you share more on her. Suggest perhaps that she join without her video.
I suggested that, yeah,
terrific.
already. Yeah,
Terrific.
yeah.
Great.
Okay, any questions to Stephen so far, comments?
Stephen, one of your points that you made about transitioning from more energy security, it looks like BP sold or is exiting their Russian stake in Rosneft oil.
Yep.
Rosneft, yep.
Yeah, Rosneft.
Yeah, that's
I can
as
help
much
with that if you want.
Yeah, that's as much about this is where the ESG is actually playing out and is part of the calculus of where people are. And it's very hard for a lot of businesses in the West to continue some of these relationships the way they've been. So I think there's going to be a rethinking of the way we approach, companies will approach working with some of their Russian relationships now, just because of the backlash that's coming. Greg, you had a view on that?
Yeah. Again,
I'm so
careful.
sorry to interrupt. Tatiana is on.
Okay.
Tatiana, would you mind just to share what's going on? And can you hear us? Probably it's very bad internet, so.
Go ahead and interrupt whenever she's back. Very quickly.
Yeah.
Careful with the initial interpretations of what's happening, right? So BP has a financial stake in Rosneft, slightly under 20%. Up to now, what they said is they're getting rid of it. People think that is some kind of shedding of the asset or not. Number one is nobody to shed it to, unless they just want to give their stock certificates or their electronic certificates to somebody else. They're going to write down the asset. It will be reflected in the quarter at zero, taking the financial hit, and then the asset will sit on the books. And if something happens in Russia that's positive, then we'll see what they actually do with that. There's different types of stakes. Exxon and Shell have stakes in Sakhalin 1 and 2. Those are more hands-on stakes where they actually participate technically in the extraction of hydrocarbons. Again, I think Shell has been forthcoming in saying they want to get out. Exxon, I don't think they made a decision yet. So we have to be really careful in terms of how this is being interpreted. Right now, there's a lot of virtue signaling going on, because it's fine. It's in the right direction and all that. But let's see really in the end when the dust settles, if it settles, what happens with these stakes.
I think that clarification is really important, Gregory, and I think it's important because I think it's misunderstood generally what happens to Rosneft on the books, and I agree with you completely. The other thing I would comment on is the realization that 8% of global grains come out of Ukraine, and that we'll have to find, as much as this is a huge humanitarian disaster, there has to be solutions to the problems that we face, certainly in Europe near term and medium term. And to solve these problems, I do believe that Europe is going to have to focus south into Africa more aggressively than it has in the past, because Africa is a potential breadbasket of note, and also offers huge natural gas and other commodities that the Europeans need, and frankly, the globe needs. And so as much as this is a disaster in the Northern Hemisphere, I think that Africa will be one of the beneficiaries from this, because it has the ability to export what is required going forward.
That's a great point. Mark, there was a question.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
Yes.
great. Yes, thank you. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Tatiana Zhiltomirskaya. I'm CMO of one of IT companies in Ukraine. I live and work in Kiev, but currently I'm in a village outside of Zhytomyr with a lot of other families of my friends that were just hiding from bombing that started 4 days ago near our house. So we had to urgently leave our house, stay outside of Kiev, because all big cities are now under continuous shelling. The bombs become big, with heavier and heavier. So every next hit hits more residential areas than previously. Most of my friends spent 5 days and nights in basements. We don't really have shelters. Don't ask why, we were not prepared to have a military attack. So we don't really have any shelters, any, organized shelters. So those are just basements. Well, we still work because we have clients around the world. We provide software development solutions, so we still continue to support our clients and continue development. Our clients are being very supportive in all possible ways. They support teams emotionally, they support us financially, giving us advance payments so that we can, give advance payments to our teams. I don't know what else to say. You can ask me questions.
Tatiana, what's happening right now? I mean, there's news in the last half an hour that there has been, that the city is surrounded, and
Yes,
there's a new bombing campaign. Can you just describe what's happened in the last 2 hours or last hour?
They're targeting communications.
Yes, they're now targeting communication networks. They just hit television tower in Kiev. So Kiev has lost television, but the government officials saying that it's going to be restored in a couple of hours. What else? The most hit are Kiev and Kharkiv, our former capital and current capital, right? So they're trying today. Our government is saying that tonight is going to be the crucial one because they are running out of whatever equipment and people they have. In the Black Sea, they had a riot on the military ships, so they asked a permission to leave Odessa Bay in the Black Sea. So they haven't invaded Odessa, they just left, which is a very good thing, right? Because we knew that they're going to be invading Odessa, and they waited and they were getting prepared for all that time to be invaded, but fortunately Russians decided not to do that. We keep hearing that even though Belarusian army, which is not under Lukashenko control anymore, it's controlled by Russian generals. Some of them they tried to get as invaders, but many of them join Ukrainian forces as well. We receive a lot of foreign support and foreign military people come to support us from Israel, from Germany, from UK. Yes, the Baltic countries. I know that many of my colleagues, just IT guys, just like us, like my friends, they joined territory volunteer forces, and some of them already died, unfortunately. And you can't really imagine. You just saw that person, and now you know that this young guy is already dead. But you can't really sign up for military forces or for territory forces because they're all full, and there's lots of reserves. So I mean, the whole country is standing up. So we're all up. We're all giving food, equipment, clothes, money to our army and to our military forces. So it's not only, which we're very grateful for all this support that we're getting, and we understand that governments started to support us as quick just because their people are forcing them to do so. So we're very grateful for that support. We never expected to get anything like that, but we're also very supportive internally, and we support each other. So we didn't really expect to get support because we didn't get it 8 years ago. So we didn't really expect to get it now.
In terms of casualties, Tatiana, what's the situation? Civilians?
Well, civilians, 16 children are dead, 45 children are wounded, more than 200 grown-ups are dead. These are all civilians. About militaries, they don't say us, probably, just to keep the spirits high.
How big is the Ukrainian armed forces for Kiev in terms of defending the city? as well as by number, and how many ordinary citizens have joined the resistance movement?
Well, 100. What we know for Kiev, that it's 60,000 people in territory forces joined in Kiev. We heard that our army is 100,000 people, but also those are who are fighting now. But the overall army is 250,000 people.
That's the Ukrainians, 250,000?
Yes, Ukrainian army.
Because there are lots of Brits. I mean, there's press here about the number of Brits that are coming over, as you mentioned. I mean, it's it's quite considerable. I'm sure that other countries are joining this, but certainly from a British perspective.
Yes, but unfortunately they don't give us numbers. I don't know, maybe for the security reasons.
But 100,000 military Ukrainians are defending the city. Is that correct?
Yes.
And do you have a sense of how many ordinary citizens have joined to kind of augment that number?
Yes, it's more than 100,000 around Ukraine and around 50 or 60,000 people in Kiev. I don't know exactly.
Okay.
Or the basic essentials available in food, water?
Yes, everything is available. They don't lack anything. The only thing that happens that when people get under bombing, then they lose connection, and they just that other people just can't get to them. Right? It's not that we don't have provision. We do have it, but sometimes it's difficult to get it to those people who,
Supply chain.
What about
and the supply chains are broken, so it's all civilians helping to provide.
Maybe you talked about this earlier. Is there greater fear of cyber attacks from coming in from the Russia side?
No, we're not fearing them at all. We never. Well, they kept doing that to us all these 8 years and before. We're just very peaceful, but we are not less smart. So now we are having a massive attack from all the IT companies that are in Ukraine. So now they are suffering from something that they never ever expected to get from us. We're very peaceful, but when we get pissed off, we become absolutely impossible to fight with. It's just so strange that the whole Ukrainian history is like that. Yeah. Ukrainian Cossacks always were like that. It's just that, I don't know, it's just probably such a self-assurance that they had. But we tried to stay peaceful for 8 years. 8 years, right? We kept those Minsk agreements, etc. Even though our military forces, they could throw them out of Ukraine for so many times, and they just didn't want a war. That's why they were always restricted not to do so. And now they have a chance to pay for all this 8 years.
Can you speak very quickly to the number of people who are leaving Ukraine and how that's like affecting life? Just anything you can share, you would like to share?
The last number that I heard about the number of refugees at the moment, Poland and all other neighboring countries, it's 350,000 people for the moment. But all the borders are flooded with people.
How many of them are from the two biggest cities? Do you know?
No, I don't have that statistics.
Do you know if there is any, Yvonne just asked, if there are any challenges with trusting neighbors? Is there any or any issues that you heard of?
Trusting neighbors in the sense that some, there, at least on the news, we've always, that I've seen, is that there are many Russian sympathizers because they were the Russian citizens from they were legacy Russians from during the Cold War. And so they're sympathizers with Russia, and they've, you know, on and off have continued to create problems around the border area. And so on that note, I was just thinking the pain and challenge of having to be concerned with somebody who's your friend, especially my family being Jewish, who had already experienced Hungary and Nazis and communism and people, you know, changing. And so I just thought I'd throw that in as a twist, and I was wondering how that works.
And we're going to wrap up with this question too. So Tatiana, thank you. Do you have a response to that? As your trust is high with your neighbors, and the question Yvonne's asked is a little different with outsiders. So how's that playing out? I don't know if she's still with us. Tatiana, thank you very much for your joining us today. And you know, our hearts go out to the struggle that you guys are going through right now. You didn't ask for this, and the heroic response is incredible, and we wish everyone could do more to help. So thank you for your time today, and thanks for joining us, and best wishes to you all during this difficult time. Adam.
Hey, Steve, is there a way that, you know, just as on the help side, has 361 thought about, I don't know, some sort of either charity or some sort of community type thing to be supportive for those that
yeah,
you know,
I can send all the information through Mirjana.
That would be great. And Rob will take it up. Mark had to step off the call for a minute, but we should come back to that because that's what this community is about. So, yeah.
Tatiana, by the way, you're welcome to stay as long as you can,
Yeah.
and you have time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Adam, we'll
Thank
turn
you
it
very
back
much.
to you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Very, very interesting, and our hearts go out to you.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you also.
So, by the way, I started already donating to different Ukrainian causes. So those of you who want some, you know, create a coordination committee how to make donations, please let me know. I'm happy to join. I will chime in a few thoughts. Number one.
Simon, we have a program. If we could get
that's fine.
To Adam, and then we'll get thoughts as we go along, because Adam's put together a pretty strong program, and people we have them on a time schedule. So Adam, why don't you take over, and we'll have to shorten them up a little bit, but you have great speakers here, so let's get going.
Thank you, Stephen. And Simon, I'd like to hear your comments at the end, certainly. Vladimir, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining us. As I said, Vladimir is an investment banker by profession and is now based in London and works with Navalny and other opposition leaders. On that note, Vladimir, I'll let you take it. And the question is, how did we get here?
Thank you, Adam, for having me. I'll speak in bullet points so there's more time for questions. Yes, most of my career has been in finance and investments. I got an MBA from Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, worked in a variety of positions in finance. I started helping Navalny in my spare time in 2010. One thing led to the other. I had to leave my job at Alpha Bank. Then I had to go to London in 2014. Traditionally, I have been responsible for fundraising, for strategy, and for relations with Western media and opinion leaders. If we talk about Navalny, over the last few years, he has emerged as undisputed most prominent Russian opposition politician. Our strategy has been consistent and it hasn't changed over years. We understand that democratic forces in Russia are too weak to take on Putin's regime. It has all the administrative levers of power, unlimited financial resources, law enforcement. So our strategy was to build a political organization that would be the strongest when a political crisis ensues in Russia. And Putin's regime may seem stable, but it's getting more fragile with every year. Now, Navalny's story of the last year and a half has been quite biblical. So he was poisoned with nerve agent in August of 2020, miraculously survived, recuperated, returned to Russia despite all threats. He has been incarcerated by Putin, has been a little bit over a year in prison. He's now undergoing another trial that can add up to 15 years to his sentence. And one of our goals is, of course, to keep attention of international public opinion and media on his situation. He's probably the most famous political prisoner now. We had to relocate all our people to outside of Russia, so we have an office of about 50 people in Vilnius. How did we get here? The ramp up to this situation, Russia has been amassing troops on Ukrainian border throughout 2021. There was escalation in December and January. This became a wide-scale crisis in international affairs. Russia has put forward unrealistic demands of NATO rolling back and guarantees of Ukraine not joining NATO. The Western countries were not very receptive to these demands naturally. And last week I was in Washington. I had meetings in Congress and in State Department. It was just before the invasion started. It was after the rebel republics were recognized by Russian authorities. And I was telling everybody whom we spoke with that I think that this is probably going to be the end of it, that Putin is not going to invade. That was my sincere conviction. It seemed to be shared by people whom I talked to. Now, February 24 changed all those calculations, and the brutal assault from all the border of Ukraine with Russia, the Black Sea, the Belarus began. Now, some analysts are saying that there is the main sort of reason for that has been expansion of NATO. This is, of course, not true. Putin has been trying to build relations with the NATO for the first 10 years of 21st century, and this attack was really unprovoked. There was no appetite internally in Russia for this war. Now, our group has been advocating for years for a more belligerent stance of the West versus Putin's regime. We have advocated personal sanctions against perpetrators of corruption and human rights. And I think if West woke up after Russia's invasion in Georgia in 2008, after Russia's annexation of Crimea and meddling in eastern Ukraine in 2014, and would have been more bold in countering this assertiveness, I think it would be, we could have avoided the situation, but we are where we are. So if we look at Putin and the West, he is a single player with a decision-making that is just vested in one person. He is unconstrained by any checks and balances, no parliamentary oversight, no, he doesn't have to answer to his electorate. And on the other side, we have the West, which is a collection of actors with different interests, which are preoccupied with their own internal politics that have to be transparent in their decision-making. And naturally, Putin, with his aggressive mindset, tried to exploit this disarray in Western policy for years. This, if we just look at the last 8 years, now the aggression in Ukraine in 2014, aggression in Middle East in 2015, multiple cyber attacks on Western countries, including meddling in US elections in 2016, political assassinations in different countries and in Russia. So this all points to quite a belligerent actor that really is not constrained. Now, this led to the war, as we see now unfolding. Situation changes every day, maybe every hour. Now, Russian advance has been slower than than was expected, and Ukrainians put up a heroic resistance, putting up heroic resistance both on the army side and on the volunteer side. At the same time, we understand that Russians are advancing. The military advantage of Russian forces is really overwhelming, and it seems like now Russians are employing a little bit different tactic, more firepower, more indiscriminate bombing, and this may lead to their further advances in the coming days. The West was quite fast in retaliations with sanctions, various types of sanctions, personal sanctions against Russian officials and businessmen. All the flights have been suspended throughout Western Europe. Some banks have been switched off SWIFT. The war has been unpopular in Russia, despite the fact that protesting in Russia has become very dangerous over the last years. Hundreds and thousands of Russians are taking to the streets, and over 6,000 people were arrested over these last days. Russia has put in retaliation measures. The stock exchange is closed. The annual repayment of debt or transfers outside of the country are suspended. There is talk about putting a stop, an embargo on foreigners selling Russian assets. So the situation is developing. Is there an exit for this situation? There have been talks between Russian and Ukrainian forces yesterday. They just started. I don't expect them to come to any fruition soon, because Putin's tolerance for pain, in terms of economic pain, in terms of casualties of Russian soldiers, is quite high. I think the war will unfortunately continue for the last for the next weeks. Unfortunately, I hope there will be a ceasefire and truce. Ideally, it would be with Russia pulling back troops to the borders as they were on the February 24. But we don't know whether that's going to happen. If for me as a Russian political analyst, this is tragic, but I think this weakens Putin's regime. This war is not supported by elites. People have seen their fortunes decimated. The white population is feeling economic pain right now with the ruble depreciating. And that's it. Last point, it's an acute situation. You are managing a lot of money. Please support Ukrainians who have need right now for humanitarian aid. We, as Anti-Corruption Foundation of Navalny, have emerged as the most prominent organization countering Putin. So if you have appetite for supporting us as well, you know how to find me. Now to questions.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions here, and then I'll let the audience start with their questions. The sanctions that are being implemented right now that were passed, your group had proposed a number of sanctions. How are the sanctions that are being imposed right now, how are they similar to the ones that you had proposed back when Alexei was poisoned?
Well, we have proposed personal sanctions against a wide circle of Putin's cronies, both officials, business people, people involved in state propaganda. Now, there is no silver bullet that the West can employ, no set of measures that would remove Putin from power and effect change in Russia. Sanctions is a blunt instrument. They're both sort of punishment for the crimes that were committed and a deterrent to people in the elite who see that their support of Putin will not go unpunished. The message that we would like, I mean, this aggression changed everything. And now it's not just personal sanctions, but a much wider array of sanctions. But the message on the personal sanctions that we would like Western countries to send to Russia is, we believe you guys committed crimes. The right avenue for these crimes to be investigated and tried is Russia. Russia is no fit place for this at this point, and you have contributed to such situations. So stay away from our borders. Don't stick your money into our financial system. We're not deeming you criminals. We're not throwing you in prison. Just stay away from us. So that's it on sanctions.
Thank you, Vladimir. Any questions from the audience? Any further questions?
If I may, Vladimir, great. Thank you for sharing everything. And what's your thought on China and Russia right now?
It's a complex situation with multiple aspects. The facts have been that China hasn't supported Russia openly. And in the ramp up to the invasion, it always advocated for territorial integrity. Now, of course, China is closely looking at the situation in light of the standoff with Taiwan. I think the Western resolve in face of this aggression and the lessons that the West will learn from this would serve to strengthen Taiwan's position. At the same time, China will probably learn and improve its playbook. So I think the West has a number of strings that they can pull in respect of China, so that China does not really support this aggressive policies of Putin. But at this point, we don't know the final point, how the situation will be resolved and where we will end up in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you.
Is there a scenario, say 2 years from now, where Putin is still in power and Russia is considered a viable global citizen country?
In my opinion, there is very little probability of that happening. I think if Putin stays in power, everybody recognizes that he and his immediate circle are war criminals. We've seen this war has been televised maybe as no other war before. The world has seen what Russian military has done in Ukraine. I don't really see Russia under Putin as being an accepted international player. Even if a truce and some sort of pacification is reached in the near future, as I hope it will.
So how does he get removed? What are the mechanisms that has to happen? How much pain do the Russian citizenry have to go through for him to go away?
These are very good questions to which I don't think anybody has answered. There are many political analysts that will give you possible scenarios. I don't like to deal in theories and guesses. I think as people in Russia become more and more disillusioned with their plight economically, in terms of rule of law, etc., I think one of the investment bank estimated that in second quarter, Russia's GDP is going to plunge 20%. This goes a long way in stirring people's discontent. And inevitably this discontent is not just for the general population, it's discontent among the business elite. The people just a week ago on Monday, there was this Security Council meeting where the decision about annexation, or not annexation, but recognition of the rebel republics was made. It was a very bizarre show with Putin acting as a school teacher with school children. And you can see that people were visibly nervous and upset. And I don't think people, even in the close circle of Putin, are enjoying this and are fully on board with that. So some people say somebody will rebel, there will be some sort of coup, etc. I don't trade in these theories. Anything is possible. It's just remains to be seen.
Hey, Vladimir, this is Rob. I'm glad you've touched base with Washington and some in your recent visit there on this. And just Adam, it seemed like just a month ago we were talking about this a little more casually, and this has developed. And I think to the point earlier of some of the other countries in Eastern Europe, from Hungary to Belarus and the like, this has ramifications from the West. But Vladimir, from your Washington engagement, I was curious. Don't feel the need to be unspecific. Could we have done more from the West side in terms of being tougher at the borders at the initial entry or other things? What are practical but firm things that you think the West could be doing now in response for greater catalysm here?
Looking back, Putin's regime is one built on economic and political corruption, and Russia has been exporting corruption and dirty money for decades. If the West was more resilient in policing its financial system, in expelling people who they know are involved in corruption and human rights abuse, I think Putin would not have been so encouraged and would not be so assertive. Now, what to do now? Again, there is no silver bullet. The measures that have been already put in place over the last few days will work to Russia being isolated and economically weakened month by month. We don't know. I hope there will be some sort of resolution in the coming weeks. I hope there will be truce, because even if Russia occupies Kiev and other major center, I don't think it will be the end of war. There will be constant guerrilla war and resistance, there are sanctions which are immediate things, but there are all, of course, the long-term things, which is, again, strengthening Western unity, rooting out corruption, and trying to weaken Putin's regime as much as possible on all possible fronts. But again, I don't think we can be speaking in any time frames here. The West has been battling with North Korea for decades. Even a country like Venezuela, who has been defying Western order, you know, Maduro's regime is still in place. So a possible scenario, and unfortunately, I must say, base case scenario is there is some sort of truce specification, and fighting will cease, sanctions will stay, Putin will stay in power, Russia will be impoverished, there will be some dissent that will be brutally put down, but this situation, I would like it to end as soon as possible, but this can stay for years.
But the greatest difference here, and the one really significant factor, is that this is the first time that we have seen not only a global attack on this government, but also the use of economic sanctions that are so severe and so much more impactful than probably any of us on this call ever expected. I never expected to see economic and also soft hits taken at Russia that will have an impact that is going to be quite magnificent in a way that I wouldn't have predicted. And that's what separates this, not only the fact that he has spilled over into Ukraine, which Venezuela did not do, but also because these sanctions are taking a big bite out of Russia's attack.
That all of the above is true. At the same time, a dictator like Putin may have quite a big tolerance for all that and for suffering of its own people, given, you know, the mighty repression apparatus that he has put in place.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Vladimir, I have a question. This is Luke. Based on your analysis, though, is that I assume that's based on traditional kind of sanctions that have typically have done before, but with the change in the way the situation is now, with the Swiss actually taking action in an unprecedented level, and also Bitcoin, there's been a call from, I think, for Bitcoin exchanges to ban any Russian users or Russian government tied accounts in transferring any kind of a Bitcoin transaction that would kind of circumvent any kind of sanctions. How does that play out?
Listen, there are not that many people who are happy about this. Anybody who is exposed to international financial system, anybody who has any assets in Russia, obviously is suffering. How much does that enter into Putin's calculations? Arguably not to a very large extent. There's also a lot of noise, like this, you know, crypto exchanges thinking about banning Russian users. I don't think this will happen, and if it happens, I don't think it will be effective. The long-term economic effect of sanctions will be felt. In terms of personal sanctions, overall, we have seen sanctions on maybe 1,000 people. I don't think more. So you have to put it into the perspective, the real effect of these immediate sanctions. They are something unprecedented in recent years, but also Putin has built Russia into kind of an economic fortress, and you know, the level of debt is low. The international reserves, even with part of it blocked and sanctioned, are quite vast. We don't know what the tolerance will be of Russian economy in these circumstances. Maybe one more question that I need to go in a few
Vladimir, let's wrap this up. The last question and your final words are, last question, how does this impact the opposition in civil unrest in Russia? And do you see any cracks in the power structure? And then your final words.
We talk about what West does with Russia's aggressiveness. The real change will come from Russia and from Russians. it probably will be some sort of combined effort in the elite and in the sort of mass population, mass protest, and also some elite revolt. I think it's pointless to think about scenarios. Our goal is to continue to be the most relevant organization, independent political organization in Russia, with putting out, media products, anti-corruption investigations. Our video on Putin's palace clocked over 100 million views on YouTube. So we are making an impact. We are the only sort of group that can organize mass-scale protests in Russia, which we have seen over the last 5 years. All these capabilities remain, and we are planning to put them to use when the situation arises. Putin has many challenges now. Standards of living will plummet. Support for government will decrease when people see the military coffins coming back from Ukraine. Challenges will multiply as a result of this, and they will result in some sort of crisis, I think, quite soon.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you very much for your time. And please put a link in the chat to your organization.
Okay, I will.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So now let me introduce DJ Peterson, a brilliant man of economics and Russian politics. I hand it over to you, DJ.
Thanks, Adam. This has been a great conversation, and I want to just weave through some key themes and what I call signposts or issues to watch as you make the decisions regarding, support to develop peace or promote peace in Ukraine, or your strategy with regards to Russia. Just again, really briefly, I was trained as a political scientist, Russian politics, Soviet politics, and international relations, and for the past 20 years, I've been advising companies on international geopolitical strategy. So I'm going to give you a kind of a quick geopolitical tour and key off some of the points you just heard. First, I want to actually focus on Europe really quickly, because what I think is quite remarkable is that Europe is really out in the lead on taking sanctions and actions to both to sanction Russia and, of course, to support Ukraine. This is it's I think quite remarkable, in part because of the density of the economic ties between Europe and Russia. So I'm continuing to watch very closely what the Europeans are doing. You've heard obviously reference also to Switzerland and its moves. I think one very important factor to watch is one reason why we've seen such a quick movement in Russia is because European populations are really upset about this. And you see these in the large demonstrations in Bern, for instance, in Switzerland, in Vienna, Prague, Berlin, has really motivated the countries to switch. And so that's a really important issue to watch is basically how much pain are Europeans willing to take in terms of the economic sanctions, but also I think it's very important to, given the direction of where things are going in Ukraine right now, what happens if gas gets cut off? And what happens if the waves of refugees go from 1 million to 2 million? You see already European politicians preparing their people to deal with, to manage larger waves of refugees. And of course, the question is what is the sustainability, the political sustainability of this very, very, I would say, aggressive position right now? Just a quick look at with U.S. I have just some conversations with the White House and some very senior people working on Russia policy. A couple really important points that the way Washington sees this. First of all, is they had, as you know, very good intelligence on Putin's attack strategy. What they're saying, though, is they had no intelligence really on how Putin was going to manage or control or rule Ukraine. And that obviously means haven't had really any intelligence on this more protracted kind of war for Ukraine, which suggests perhaps one is the intelligence isn't good, but I think more importantly is that the planning in Russia is not that good. And so this is kind of a wide open scenario. My latest kind of communication with the White House is that they're actually quite worried about how this might end or how they can end this. Again, as we've heard, the off ramps are not. The search for off ramps is obviously going on right now, and there's a lot of uncertainty and many unsavory from options. I would say, just looking at the situation, as I think we heard just amazingly from Tatiana in Ukraine, is the paradox is that while Ukraine is dramatically outgunned in terms of the militaries, the farther Russia goes, the harder it is to sustain in terms of supply chains, in terms of just, their personnel and their people, their morale, food. And so what is very clear, this is not going as planned for Moscow. And that then feeds into, well, how can you change the calculus of Moscow and in this search for an exit? I am certainly of the opinion that Moscow cannot control Ukraine. It maybe holds some key points, but as we've heard, the fierceness of the counterinsurgency is going to continue to grow. That also suggests perhaps a very, very painful scenario as we're seeing perhaps the early stages playing out in Kharkiv, which is very close to the Russian border. I want to jump to China and put this in the larger geopolitical context for you as well. As a Russia expert, as a foreign policy expert, as many people in Russia will tell you, there's not a lot of love between Russia and China. And a lot of people kind of played down the growing relationship, both military and economic, between China and Russia. And I think a number of people have been surprised of actually in the recent years, certainly since 2014, how deep that relationship has actually gotten. I still see it as very transactional, but it is very deep in many ways. I think Putin's visit to Ukraine to Beijing and right before at the opening of the Olympics is significant. I do think personally that Putin gave President Xi a heads up that this was coming, that this would obviously come right after the Olympics, that he wasn't going to snow on their parade. I think in this deal, China got a great deal. If you look at the situation right now, China is Russia's lender of last resort and its trader of last resort. So it is getting a very good price for Russian goods. I think the challenge right now, as we're going into day 5 and day 6, is does China want a basket case or a pariah as a partner? And this is where you're starting to see today perhaps some signaling that China wants to play a role as a peacemaker. I personally think that this is a very important shift, and that China has probably more than any other country an important role to play in finding an off-ramp or a ceasefire or a truce, as we just heard. Again, going back to my first comment, the anger and in Europe is very great, and so you can see Europeans putting pressure on Beijing to rein in their partner. As we heard from Alexander, the Chinese have been actually walking a very torturous diplomatic line here. As you probably all know, China very strongly supports things like terms like negotiation and cooperation. Obviously, they support national sovereignty and non-aggression, non-interference. So this argument is getting more and more torturous, and again, kind of the hypocrisy, I'd say, in the eyes of the Europeans becomes greater. And so you can really see some interest by the leaders in Beijing to kind of dial back or rein in Russia to the extent that they can. It's very important. What you're seeing in the Chinese media is that Ukraine is not Taiwan. They're very clear about that on a number of fronts. And I won't go into the details there, but obviously the Taiwanese are watching the situation in Ukraine very carefully. They're sending some assistance to Ukraine. Defending. It's very for some in Taiwan. It's a very important signal that they want to support other democratic movements. But I don't take any positive. I don't think Taiwan. This is a warning sign for Taiwan. Longer term, I do not see an action right away against Taiwan by Beijing. In many cases, Beijing already owns Taiwan, and Taiwan is fairly compliant. I don't see an action right now, or kind of this idea that while the West is focused on Ukraine, China does something else. China really wants stability in the world right now, and I think they're really focused on getting stability in Europe and in Russia. Again, they don't want a basket case. I just want to close with a couple words around where the discussion was. Obviously, there's several scenarios that we've heard kind of mooted around what happens in Moscow, and I think ways to look at the situation right now is the best scenario is a negotiation for peace. The idea that Russia would be forced in some ways to retreat or to sue for peace, or that there would be regime change in Russia is catastrophic for Russia. And it's a very grim scenario. It really takes you back, obviously, to 1991, but also 1918. So the idea that Putin needs to go is in many ways true, but in many ways you don't want a catastrophic loss or loss of face for Russia here, because if that's the perception of where it's going, I think the situation continues to get really bad. And of course, what we've seen is, again, like we've had severe sanctions on Venezuela, and the leadership is still there, severe sanctions on Iran, Syria, the leaders are still there, North Korea. There are scenarios where the leaders stay and you get some kind of negotiated, and I'll stop there and I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you, DJ. Before we start taking questions, I'd like to mention that JP Natkin was not able to join because he had an emergency meeting with one of his clients. Obviously, at this time, everyone's in very high demand that's dealing with Russia. So, and he sends his regards and looks forward to speaking another time. Back to DJ, any questions? And I know that, yes, Rob, I knew it was going to be you. You had your hand up.
That was a message, but a separate message. But I thought that was very, very a prudent input, DJ. Particularly on both the China part, the thought of looking this long term. Can you give some comparison, or is there strength built on, the Afghanistan model? Likewise, in terms of long term, you think about Cuba and Castro and his longevity through, what was it, 4 or 5 presidents. Putin has, Putin's only 68 or so. 69. And, good health and what have you. I know there's a lot of different ranges here, but he's a pretty good chess player. I think a lot of this is about either face saving, and he's also a very wealthy man. no matter what comes out of this. So I guess DJ, the sort of comparisons to Cuba and lessons from Afghanistan, how is that blending into your macro view here?
Sure, thank you. I like the analysis of Putin as a chess player, or the kind of analogy. I also think that Putin has been playing with a very weak hand. He's not strategic in many ways. Again, there was no strategy. I see no strategy for owning Ukraine, to put it crudely. And obviously the counterinsurgency is belying any kind of that would be easy or manageable and doable. I do think the longevity piece is really important. Let's just run a scenario where the Chinese broker a deal, and exactly as Alexander said, basically the conflict is frozen. Let's just say frozen to a week ago. You have Russia owns Crimea, eastern provinces, eastern portions of eastern provinces, but it pulls back its troops away from Kiev, for instance, and Kharkov. It becomes a frozen conflict. Russia does that very well. That's what they do with these kind of crazy frozen conflicts. But a key point is even if the situation is dialed back, it's very important to understand that sanctions, especially US sanctions, do not get dialed back very easily. I mean, if you look at the post-Soviet, how long it took sanctions or trade restrictions after the 20 years for them to finally kind of be dialed back after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you're going to see very sticky sanctions, and also things like the BP exit or hiatus. I mean, it's not going to be like they're going to be able to rush back in for a variety of reasons and kind of resume business. And so, unfortunately, what this looks like is just grinding long-term economic implications for Russia, and of course, Ukraine as well.
So far, no one has mentioned Putin's move to, you could say, stand up the readiness of these forces that include, I guess, the nuclear arsenal, so to speak. On a scale of 1 to 10, how serious is that? How serious should we take that, and what do you see are the implications of that?
Lauren, thanks for that question. It's as a student of the Cold War, it's mentally, analytically, it's actually really hard to put this in your decision making, because it's still fairly low probability, but the consequences are so catastrophic, and so it's difficult. I would definitely say that the risk has doubled. Is it a 10% risk now? And one reason why I am concerned about it is, again, if you look at, obviously the nuclear forces are tightly controlled, but obviously this war is not going to plan. And as we saw in 2014 with the shooting down of an airliner, there's just so much opportunities for miscalculation or mistakes. And so I put it more in the not intentional, but unintentional accidents. I think it's still a low probability, but in terms of somebody who is advising or just putting things on your radar at this point, I think it's important to consider. Similarly, I thought Tatiana's comments around cyber is very interesting. The analogy, the image is, when did the lights go out? And again, that's a signal of what Russia might be willing to do to gain control. But to me, the cyber element, I think, is a larger risk and actually has greater risk of proliferation. Now, what you hear coming out of Washington is this shields up, and there's nothing unusual, different, no new secret weapons. It's just shields up using and the existing kind of, Russians are going to use this existing kind of palette of cyber weapons. And so, but the opportunity for miscalculation and then escalation. I think what The Biden administration has been very clear as they're threatening the use of cyber counterattacks. And right now it seems to be kind of a tense standoff. But miscalculation is big. So I would put a lot. And then finally, I would just say there's this really gray area in between, which you've heard things like thermobarbaric bombs, or these kind of weapons of mass destructions, you might call it, or just kind of unconventional ways. What we've seen, Lauren, obviously in Grozny, in Syria, is that the Russian military, Russian forces can use a lot of different tools, and a lot of it can be very ugly.
DJ, when you think about the unintended consequences of the sanctions, what one or two stand out most for you as things we should be considering economically, the economic fallout of the unintended consequences of these sanctions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, obviously, right now, the Europeans are willing, it seems to be, to use sanctions. But obviously, as supply chains get disrupted longer and longer, I think it's very interesting is how fragile the global supply chains are right now, and subject to minor perturbations, which cause significant problems. So one issue to watch, again, is the tolerance for Europeans to deal with supply chain disruptions over weeks and months, grinding on. This could have, as you know, there's a lot of European companies that depend on Russia for very critical parts. It might not be a large part of their trade portfolio, but it's a very critical piece, whether it's platinum, palladium, cobalt, nickel, obviously some of the kind of other rare elements. At this point, I cannot discount the gas getting shut off. Whether pipeline gets hit and that causes a short-term disruption, or it takes a while to repair, or Putin just shuts it off. If you listen to both what's coming out of Beijing and what's coming out of Moscow, this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a battle between Russia and the West. And by the way, it's the US is to blame. The Chinese are blaming the US. That's when all of a sudden natural gas becomes, I think, a part of the picture.
This plays right into China's wanting to be equal in the US in global standing. And if they can go in and negotiate, it changes their tone internally and really supports Xi's longer term goals.
This is a moment for them to really capitalize as a global leader. And really change the equation with the United States. As an American, we'll have to deal with it. It could, if they can get their act together. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing either. The US and China have been looking for ways to cooperate. This could be a signature event. We cooperated in the post-war World War II architecture with the Soviet Union.
It doesn't have to be a bad thing. That's right. So interesting to watch that play out.
DJ, and Steve, for you, I've got to ask this question. How viable is the rumored plan, maybe it's more than that, for the US dollar to be trumped, as the world reserve currency, and for commodities to no longer be purchased and sold in US dollars? Is that something either both of you could comment on? It seems like a scary thing that could happen. That would really hurt the US, I think.
Sure. There's just several things I would say. First of all, obviously cutting key Russian banks and institutions out of SWIFT obviously accelerates the search for workarounds and alternatives. And that's obviously something that China would like to do in cahoots or in partnership with Russia. So you're going to see, and obviously a lot of trade has already shifted into renminbi from the dollar with de-dollarization in Russia. This is going to accelerate it. Again, in many ways, Russia is going to come out much stronger from this, and the weakening of the dollar is one of them. But I do not see the dollar going away. And obviously, what you're seeing is it still has tremendous import, and Russia's not going to be able to diversify away now. Really, it's too late for them to do that or to manage to kind of. But it's for the future, yes, for future conflicts. There will be more workarounds, and then of course there's crypto, and what that means.
Does anybody have a understanding of the energy infrastructure supply chain in Russia? I'm just going back to when we had the COVID crisis here, and energy demand went from like 100 million barrels a day to 92 million barrels a day in like 2 weeks. And what you found was you can't just turn the faucets off and all this stuff goes away. So is there a capacity for Russia to, if they were to cut off the energy supply to Europe? I mean, it seemed to me, maybe they got a cavern or two they can fill, but I mean, is that really realistic that they turn that supply off for 6 months? To the point where the storage facilities in Europe get depleted? Or, I mean, they got to put it somewhere. Are they going to go send it to China? China got a big energy bank somewhere to hold all this stuff?
No, I think, Duncan, your point is right. But then again, the only thing you're right, you can't just shut off gas. I mean, you have to shut down the whole network, right? And leave it in the ground. You just can't store it. There's nowhere else for most of it to go right now. I guess my only scenario is that Putin made a tragic decision, and I would say very ill-advised decision, to go into Ukraine like he has. And he thought he would probably own the country, and within a few days it would be pretty neat and clean. So you could see where this kind of decision-making, again, Putin is I believe is very isolated. And social psychology, I mean, political psychology is a dangerous field. But again, as we heard, people referencing earlier, it doesn't sound like the decision making is very solid right now on solid ground in the Kremlin. So you could see a lot of that's why I think things like nuclear, cyber, gas, I think they have to be considered to be on the table from a business and strategy planning.
He also threatened space disruption too, for satellites and other assets that are non-Russian.
DJ, oh, sorry.
If I could, I'm sorry, if I could follow up on Duncan's question. I wonder, given the fact that it seems as though this is a moral crusade for Putin more than anything else, that the tolerance for Europe to handle if he did cut the gas off, it also works both ways. That way he doesn't get funding from that either. Who can hold their breath longer in that? And I don't want to color the answer, but if I were European and looking at potentially what could happen to the Baltic states after what he's done to Ukraine, I think I could hold my breath for a long time. But I'll interested in your thought on that.
Yeah, clearly part of the again, if you think about this is really a war against the West, and to break up Europe, to split Europe, and obviously to split Europe from the US, one of the tools or weapons is refugees, right? Mm-hmm. And already we're at 1 million, or in the territory of 1 million refugees. Right now, they've been pretty well received. But if you can have create a mass refugee crisis, does that really kind of drive Europe into either, does it divide wedges between states or within states? So Putin could be winning ultimately in his own eyes. It's just, again, it's a different rationality. And I think if you look at the messianic language that he's using, he's playing, at least internally in his own head, with a different set of values and decision cues.
DJ,
Hey, I have a quick question. Is there any chance that driving up oil prices was part of the strategy, since the majority of their revenue comes through oil and gas?
I think part of it is yes, because I do believe that the Russians did not expect the sanctions that they got, the intensity of sanctions that they got. So this I think is a backfire situation.
But DJ, weren't the sanctions carved out to kind of put the energy to the side for now, and that's not been hit, so that the energy security issue is kind of fragile right now because of that?
Right. And I think, I was frankly surprised at where the ruble landed. It's not in catastrophic. It suggests that because of things like continuing, revenue flows because of oil and gas transit, that shipments, that that there's some still legs in the currency, obviously legs in the economy. The way that I'm looking at this situation is there was like, it's changing in like these 3 to 4 days scenarios, segments, and the situation dramatically changed on Sunday with sanctions, and now we're seeing kind of it's in a new phase now where we're getting a more kind of a heavy military attack, artillery strategy, and I think it's the same way with the sanctions. I think we have to wait a few more days to see where it plays out. And that also means, where does it play out for Russians on the streets, and how are they reading the situation? We got to wait a little longer.
DJ, just 2 quick what ifs. If we did not withdraw from Afghanistan, would this have happened? And then if Trump had won a second term, would this have happened?
Not to get political at all.
Yeah, thank
Rob,
you.
Go for it.
I guess what I would say is that
I mean, there's some meat to this. I think you know where I'm coming from.
Well, again, if you think about Putin's long-term, what he's been, again, kind of restoring Russia's greatness, but oftentimes, greatness as a spoiler, but also, dividing US and Europe, and dividing European countries. I think, yes, obviously Afghanistan was seen as a weak moment. And obviously it did not, Afghanistan was not good for allied relations. So I would definitely kind of put that into the calculus, but my sense, and I think what you heard earlier in this conversation, is that there is a long-term kind of inexorable kind of movement, and certainly the US situation, the kind of our internal divisions and weaknesses definitely kind of enabled this, or not enabled this, but kind of probably goes into the calculus of certainly Beijing and I believe of Moscow as well. I don't think Trump would have made a difference. Putin would have gotten what he wanted, so to speak, gone for what he wanted.
DJ, I was really interested in your 1991 comment and the balkanization. How deep is this line of thinking in DC, right? Because this brings another, 46 Oblast, 11 time zones, united under one ruthless dictator behaves in one way, under the chaos of no governance behaves a different way, and then with nukes actually spread out all over the country, right? So we go back into that situation of the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, and then somebody has to recapture all the nukes and all that. That seems to be one of the strong points for Putin actually to survive. But is this actually something that Washington's consider deeply?
I don't think they've gone so far yet in that. What I do think is that, again, they're worried about a range of scenarios. Let's just say, Putin does a deal with Patrushev, and Patrushev steps up. I mean, is Patrushev, the national security advisor, former KGB head, is he going to sue for peace? I mean, what is he going to do then? And how does he land this airplane, so to speak? There's not a lot of interesting scenario, not interesting, actually, that's the wrong word, but it's hard to play this out right now. But what I would, again, Gregory, what I'm just saying back, you know, I spent a lot of time in Russia, 91, 92. Obviously, Russia is a very different country than the Soviet Union in the run up to that period. My point is that this is just humiliating for Russia in so many ways, potentially. It already is humiliating for Russia. And how do you manage that? And any idea and that the US comes out of this victoriously and that Russia is humiliated. Obviously, there's all these, you know, World War I analogies there. It's just very, it's a very challenging situation right now. There's just no easy answers. This is where, in some ways, China can actually really step in and defuse kind of this US-Russia Manichaean fight.
Thanks.
TJ, along those lines, you had mentioned Putin's good friend Nikolai Patrushev. The decision-making process in this. Is there any insight as to what that process was and who were the ones that were? You knew I was going to ask this. And who are the ones in that?
Yeah, Adam. So my view of that show, this National Security Council show, was that, you know, some read it when the intelligence chief said, "Oh, I'm supporting the proposition to annex Eastern, the People's Republics," and he was beaten down. That he kind of spilled the beans, like, "Oh, this is what really is going on at the National Security Council. This is actually much more aggressive." That was kind of a lot of people in the West said. And my view was he didn't know what he should be saying, that he didn't know what song he should be singing. And again, if you just even look at this, the theatrics of Putin on, you know, 50 feet on the other side of the room, and he's berating these people, it just suggests that he's extremely isolated, and even his top team doesn't know what the game is. And so again, I think there's some really bad decision-making going on here. And who makes good decisions now in Russia to kind of resolve the situation? It's not clear to me.
Thank you, DJ.
One last question, DJ. In terms of the post-World War II institutions that were supposed to help us through all this, whether it was the United Nations, NATO, go through the list, what do you think changes in that area as we go forward? Because the world's wasn't designed for the world back then that we have today.
Right. This is a really big question. In some ways, this crisis has unfolded actually very much in old school format, so to speak. You see the US and the allies rallying together. You see these kind of Western existing institutions being mobilized in various ways. You also see like the Japan coming in as a kind of a post-Cold War, you know, a post-war ally chiming in, South Korea chiming in, even in Singaporeans. And then, of course, you don't see it, in many ways, Russia's attack is very traditional, people at heavy armor. And in some ways, so we're kind of stuck in or we are actually in a kind of a Cold War scenario still. But then you see other, obviously, factors whether it's, obviously we've mentioned things like, you know, blockchain and cryptocurrencies and the shift away from the dollar, China playing a different role, the Indians. I think it's really important to watch what India is doing, because it's suggesting that that kind of logic, the Cold War logic, post-war logic, doesn't hold anymore. And so I think we're kind of, there's like two levels, two games we're trying to negotiate through. And frankly, I kind of go back to the Yalta Summit in 1945, where you're kind of managing this transition from the end of the war to the new arena. And it's just, you're kind of like, maybe you're actually creating the architecture of the future in the process.
Thank you very much. Adam, great job pulling the program together. You want to close with comments?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I'd like to thank Stephen, you and Mark and 361 and the whole community for allowing us to do this presentation. I hope that, well, I think this is probably going to be one of several ongoing presentations on the Russia-Ukraine or Russia situation. I don't see an end to this. What DJ had mentioned in terms of humiliation, this is very humiliating for Putin. It is a 1991 moment. I see it. That's my view. I don't see Putin recovering from this. I don't see how he can recover from this. That's it. I hope that this is negotiated to some peaceful end. Not exactly sure how that is done in this situation.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, really for pulling this together. This was really exceeded all expectations.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you all for coming every week. And to Mariana, thank you for getting Tatiana on the call.
Yes, also,
it gave a completely put a much tighter human face on what's going on over there. And in the chat is the place to donate to, and I'm sure Mark and I will be talking with about what we as a community might do and moving forward. There's a lot of ideas there, but whatever help we can give, what this community has always been about. So thank you guys for today, and Mariana, thank you for bringing her on, and DJ as well. Thanks.
Thank you, DJ.
Pleasure. I'll ask Tatiana to, if she can, obviously join the next one as well. So